My blind date took me to a junkyard instead of cafe. Then he proved he was worth more than any cafe could be. Tess Rourke was 3 miles from the salvage yard when her Corolla's dashboard lit up with the battery warning light, on steady and staying on instead of the occasional flicker it had been doing all week, which told her the alternator had finally stopped charging altogether and she was running on whatever the battery had left in the tank. And she gripped the wheel a little tighter and did the mental math on whether that would be enough to make it the rest of the way without the engine cutting out on her in traffic. The dash lights had already dimmed once at the last stoplight, the radio cutting out completely for a second before flickering back on, and Tess muttered something under her breath about the exact worst possible night for her car to finally give up. Since tonight was supposed to be a blind date, not a roadside emergency. She was 27, worked the parts counter at Value Auto Supply 5 days a week, and had spent enough of those days diagnosing exactly this kind of electrical symptom for other people's cars that she knew precisely what was wrong with her own without needing to pop the hood, a dying alternator no longer holding a charge, probably a worn-out voltage regulator or a slipping serpentine belt not spinning it fast enough anymore. The kind of repair that cost maybe $40 in parts if you found the right used unit, or closer to $200 if you walked into a dealership and let them replace it with something new still in the box. She'd been nursing a weak alternator for about a week now, the kind that still put out enough charge on the highway stretch of her commute to get her through most days, jumping the battery maybe twice when a string of short trips hadn't given it enough time to recover, telling herself she'd deal with it once her next paycheck cleared. Tonight was the first time it had gone from weak to fully checked out, and she was 3 miles from meeting a total stranger, hoping the last of the battery's charge held together long enough to get there. She'd been putting off the repair for reasons that had less to do with pride and more to do with a checking account that hovered somewhere around $90 most weeks after rent and her share of the utilities. The kind of budget where a $200 dealership bill wasn't just inconvenient. It meant choosing between fixing the car and actually eating groceries instead of ramen for the back half of the month. She looked up the part online 3 separate times, gotten as far as adding a rebuilt unit to her cart, and closed the tab every time without checking out, telling herself she'd figure something out before the battery finally quit for good. Her coworker Roz had set the whole thing up 2 weeks earlier, cornering Tess at the parts counter during a slow Tuesday afternoon and refusing to let the subject drop. "You know Dominic, right? Guy who comes in every week for interchange parts off his uncle's yard? He's been asking about you." Tess had barely known the name, mostly recognized his face from the handful of times he'd stood at her register buying gaskets and hose clamps. Quiet, polite, never made small talk longer than the transaction required. "He's not pushy," Roz had said, reading the hesitation on Tess's face. "Just genuinely seems like a decent guy who works too much. Give it one shot. Worst case, you get a free dinner out of it." Except Dominic hadn't suggested dinner. When he'd called Tess 2 nights earlier to actually set a plan, voice a little rougher than she expected, less smooth than most guys who called about a date, he'd asked her straight out what was wrong with her car, because Roz had mentioned in passing that Tess kept jumping her battery in the mornings. "Sounds like your alternator's shot," he'd said, not as a diagnosis so much as a simple observation. "I work the yard at my uncle's place, Vance Salvage, out on Route 9. We could pull you a used one for about $40 instead of you paying dealer price. Figured that beats sitting across a table making small talk over food neither of us can really afford anyway." Tess had laughed out loud into the phone, caught off guard by how practical it was, how little it resembled every other blind date setup she'd sat through in the past 2 years. "You're asking me to spend our first date at a junkyard. I'm asking you to spend our first date saving $80 on a part you actually need," Dominic had said, and something dry and unbothered in his voice made the whole thing feel less like a gimmick and more like a guy who genuinely didn't see the point in wasting money on a restaurant when there was a real problem sitting right in front of them. "No pressure if it sounds terrible. I can grab dinner reservations instead if you'd rather do the normal thing." "No," Tess had said, surprising herself with how quickly the answer came. "The junkyard sounds better than normal, actually." Now with the warning light still glowing steady and the engine starting to hesitate at each stoplight, Tess pulled into the gravel lot of Vance Salvage on a Friday evening, right as the sun was dropping low enough to turn the rows of stacked cars gold and rust-colored at the same time, killing the engine the second she parked out of habit, the way you learn to do when you're not sure the battery will turn it back over. The yard stretched out behind a chain-link fence topped with rusted barbed wire, rows and rows of vehicles in every state of disassembly, hoods gone, doors missing, some sitting up on cinder blocks where the wheels had already been pulled, and a hand-painted wooden sign over the gate that read, "Vance Salvage. You pull it, cash only. Open Monsat 8 a.m. to 6 p.m." Dominic was waiting near the gate when she walked up, 30 years old, leaning against a stack of tires in worn jeans, in a faded gray t-shirt with the yard's logo half cracked off the front, a tool bag slung over one shoulder, and a pair of leather work gloves tucked into his back pocket, looking exactly as unpolished and exactly as comfortable in his own skin as he had every time she'd rung him up at the parts counter. "You made it," he said, pushing off the tire stack. "Figured your alternator might not cooperate." "It's hanging on by a thread," Tess admitted, glancing back at her car like it might give up the ghost right there in the lot. "Warning light's been on solid since I left the apartment. No charge going in at all as far as I can tell." "Then we're doing this at exactly the right time," Dominic said, and led her toward the gate where an older man sat inside a small plywood booth collecting the entry fee. $5 each, cash only. A hand-lettered receipt book sitting next to an ancient cash register that looked older than either of them. The booth walls were papered floor to ceiling with taped-up interchange charts and faded photographs of engine parts. Decades of accumulated knowledge nobody had ever bothered to digitize, and a hand-painted placard nailed above the register read, "No refunds, no exceptions. You pull it, you own it," lettering gone soft and sun-bleached from what looked like years hanging in that same spot. "This is my Uncle Ray. Runs the place. I mostly just work the counter and keep the interchange sheets updated." Ray waved them past the $5 gate fee without collecting it, the same way he always did for family, already half absorbed in a crossword puzzle spread across the booth's narrow counter, and Dominic led Tess down the third row of the yard, past a rusted-out minivan and a pickup with its bed completely stripped, checking a laminated interchange sheet clipped to a binder ring hanging off his tool bag. "Corolla, what year's yours?" "Oh, 9, Tess said, following him past another row. "Alternator on that generation's interchangeable with the whole Corolla lineup from about 03 through 11. Same mounting bracket, same amperage rating," Dominic said, flipping to a page on the binder and running his finger down a column of numbers. "Row 11's got 2 Corollas from that window. One's already missing its alternator. Somebody beat us to it, but the other one should still have it if nobody's pulled it yet." They found the second Corolla 3 rows over, a faded blue sedan with a shattered windshield and a hood already popped from some previous visitor. And Dominic set his tool bag down on the gravel, pulling out a ratchet set, a socket extension, and a pair of safety glasses that he handed to Tess without asking if she wanted them. "First thing, we kill the battery connection before we touch anything electrical, even on a car that's been sitting dead in a yard for who knows how long, because you'd never trust a battery's fully drained until you've actually disconnected it yourself." "I know," Tess said, taking the safety glasses and sliding them on. "I sell this stuff for a living, remember? I just don't usually get my hands dirty pulling it myself." "Then tonight's your lucky night," Dominic said, something like a smile pulling at his mouth as he handed her a second ratchet from the bag. "Negative terminal first, always. 10 millimeters should fit that bolt." Tess crouched down at the battery, working the ratchet onto the negative terminal bolt with more confidence than she expected to have, loosening it and pulling the cable free. And Dominic nodded once in approval before moving around to the front of the engine bay, tracing the serpentine belt with one finger until he found the alternator bolted low near the bottom of the engine block. "2 mounting bolts and the belt tension bracket," he said, positioning the socket on the first bolt. "Belt comes off first, or we're fighting the tension the whole time trying to get it out." They worked through it together over the next 20 minutes, Dominic loosening the tensioner pulley, while Tess worked the belt free from the crankshaft pulley with careful, patient pressure, both of them trading the ratchet back and forth as the bolts came stubborn in places, rust seized into threads that hadn't turned in years. At one point, a bolt refused to budge entirely, and Dominic reached into his tool bag for a can of penetrating oil, spraying the joint and tapping the socket wrench with the heel of his hand rather than forcing it. Patient in a way that told Tess he'd learned the hard way what happened to a stripped bolt head when somebody got impatient with rusted steel. By the time the alternator finally came loose in Dominic's hands, heavy and greasy and streaked with years of engine grime, both of them had grease smudged up past their wrists and a thin layer of rust dust settled into the creases of their knuckles. $40, Dominic said, holding the alternator up for inspection, checking the pulley for play by spinning it with his thumb. Bearing feels tight, no wobble. This'll outlast the rest of your car, probably. That's either really reassuring or really depressing, Tess said, wiping her hands on a rag he offered from the tool bag. Little of both, most nights out here, Dominic said, and something easy passed between them as they walked back toward Ray's booth to settle up. The gold evening light fading into the deeper orange of early dusk, just shy of 6 o'clock, rows of dead cars throwing long shadows across the gravel, and Tess realized somewhere around the third row that she hadn't thought once about her dying dashboard light since they'd started working, too busy learning the particular rhythm of a stranger who explained things without talking down to her and handed her a wrench instead of doing the job in front of her like a performance. Dominic pulled 220s from his own wallet at the booth, waving off Tess's attempt to split it. Ray runs a strict no-favoritism policy on pricing. Family pays same as anybody else walking through that gate. So this isn't me being generous. It's just me covering it because I offered first. Tess let it go, filing away the detail that a man who'd grown up in this business still didn't expect anything handed to him for free, not even from his own uncle. So, Tess said as Dominic tucked the alternator into a plastic grocery bag, same time next week we install it? Tomorrow morning, if you're free, Dominic said, glancing toward her Corolla sitting dead in the lot. That battery's not going to turn over after sitting drained this long, and you can't drive it home the way it is now. I've got a jump pack in my truck. I'll get you started and follow you back to your place. Make sure you don't stall out in traffic. Then we keep the engine off until we get the new alternator in tomorrow. One more drive on that battery's about all you've got left. Tess looked at the plastic bag in his hands, then back at her car, working through the same electrical math he'd already done. You're going to follow me 3 miles home just to make sure I don't get stranded? 3 miles both ways, Dominic said, already walking toward his truck. It's not a favor, it's just logistics. You came out here to fix a problem. No point letting you end up on the side of Route 9 with hazards on because we didn't think it through. The jump pack was a heavy black brick with commercial-grade clamps, the kind tow truck drivers carried, and Dominic hooked it to her battery without ceremony. Positive first, then negative to the engine block for a clean ground. The Corolla turned over rough on the first crank, hesitated, then caught with a shudder that said the battery had maybe 20 minutes of runtime left in it before the fuel pump quit. Don't turn it off until you're parked at your place, Dominic said, unhooking the pack. And don't use the radio, headlights, or anything else that'll pull extra draw. I'll be right behind you the whole way. He followed her tail lights the entire 3 miles back toward her apartment, flashers on, keeping close enough that she could see his headlights in her mirror the whole way. And when she pulled into her building's lot and finally killed the engine in her numbered space, he pulled in behind her, climbed out, and walked up to her driver's window. Leave it here, he said. I'll be back tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, and we'll get the new one in before the day heats up. You've got plans before then? Just not driving anywhere, Tess said, and something in the careful, practical way he'd handled the whole thing. No drama, no performance, just a guy making sure the problem actually got solved instead of half solved. Made her smile despite the dead car. Junkyard tomorrow, same as tonight? Same as tonight, Dominic said, except tomorrow you'll actually be able to drive home afterward. Tess watched his truck pull back out of the lot, taillights disappearing toward Route 9, and realized she'd just spent her first date getting jumped in a parking lot by a man with a commercial-grade battery pack, and somehow it was better than every restaurant she'd sat through in the past 2 years. 6 weeks into whatever this had become, Tess Rourke could install a serpentine belt with her eyes half closed, tension the crankshaft pulley by feel, and diagnose a bad ground strap faster than half the guys who worked the service bay 2 doors down from her own parts counter, all of it learned across a string of Saturday afternoons that started with one dying alternator and somehow never really stopped. What started as two people trading tools in a gravel lot turned into the week Dominic Vance got an offer letter that could fix every financial problem he had and cost him everything he actually wanted, and it landed on his kitchen table 3 days before he figured out how to tell Tess about it. The alternator install had gone exactly the way Dominic promised that first night. Both of them crouched in Tess's apartment parking lot the following Saturday morning. Him walking her through retensioning the serpentine belt with a breaker bar, while she held the new alternator steady against its mounting bracket, threading the two bolts by hand before torquing them down to spec with a click-style torque wrench he kept in his truck for exactly this kind of job. The car started clean on the first try, dashboard lights steady and bright instead of flickering, and Tess had actually clapped once. Delighted in a way that made Dominic laugh out loud right there in the parking lot, grease still smudged across one cheek where she'd wiped her forehead without thinking. "Told you it'd outlast the rest of the car," Dominic said, packing the old dead alternator into a cardboard box for scrap. "Core charge refund on that thing's another $15 back in your pocket if you drop it at the parts store, by the way. Most people forget cores are worth money." Tess filed that away with something like professional respect, because even after 5 years behind a parts counter, she'd never once thought about her own dead alternator as anything other than trash. The weeks after that had settled into something neither of them had planned exactly, but both of them kept showing up for anyway. Tess coming by the yard some Sunday afternoons to help Dominic and his Uncle Ray convert their decades of handwritten interchange cards into an actual spreadsheet Tess built on her own laptop, cross-referencing part numbers and compatible model years into something searchable instead of a binder held together with rubber bands and hope. Dominic paid it back the way he knew how, showing up at her apartment one Thursday evening with a new serpentine belt tensioner for her own car after noticing a faint squeal she hadn't even mentioned, replacing it in her building's parking lot in under 20 minutes, while she brought out 2 glasses of iced tea and sat on the curb watching him work. "You didn't have to do that," Tess said, handing him a glass once he'd wiped his hands. "Heard the squeal 3 visits in a row," Dominic said, taking a long drink. "Figured it'd bug me more than it bugged you eventually, so I fixed it before it turned into me complaining about a noise that isn't even my car." "That's a very practical way of saying you care about me," Tess said, grinning. "I'm full of surprises," Dominic said, deadpan enough that it took her a second to realize he was joking, and something about the dry, unhurried rhythm of him had become one of her favorite things these past 6 weeks. A guy who said almost nothing dramatic and somehow made every ordinary Thursday feel like it mattered. It was on one of those ordinary evenings, sitting on the tailgate of his truck outside the yard after closing, that Dominic finally told her the real reason he worked as hard as he did. "Ray's 62, he said, watching the last of the daylight fade over the rows of stacked cars. "Been running this place since before I was born. He wants to retire in the next 2 years, and he's offered to sell me his half of the business instead of just closing it down or selling to some corporate outfit that'd bulldoze it into a parking lot." "That's huge," Tess said. "Are you doing it?" "Trying to," Dominic said, and something in his voice went a little tighter. "Bank's giving me trouble on the loan. Back when I was 24, I co-signed a truck loan for a buddy who skipped town on the payments, tanked my credit for years digging out of that mess. And even though it's clean now, banks still look at anything under 7 years old like it's a red flag. I've got maybe 60% of the down payment saved, and the loan officer keeps hedging every time I bring in new paperwork." "How much more do you need?" Tess asked. $18,000, give or take, between the down payment shortfall and enough working capital to cover the first few slow months, Dominic said. "I've been picking up weekend tow jobs on top of the yard just to build the number faster. But at this rate, it's another year, maybe more, before the bank stops hedging." Tess didn't offer to fix it for him, didn't reach for her own thin savings account. Like that would solve anything, just sat with him on the tailgate, letting the numbers settle the way real problems settled, heavy and unglamorous. "That's a lot to be carrying alone." "Ray's been patient about it," Dominic said, "but patient doesn't stop the clock. He's not getting younger, and the offer's not going to sit open forever if the bank keeps stalling." 3 days later, an offer letter showed up in Dominic's mailbox from Continental Auto Recyclers, a corporate salvage chain that ran a dozen yards across 4 states, the kind of outfit that had bought up half the independent you-pull-it lots in the region over the past decade, standardized their interchange systems, and put uniformed employees behind computer terminals instead of laminated binder sheets. Tess had actually heard of them before, mostly from customers at her own parts counter, complaining that Continental's core prices had dropped since a family-run yard 2 towns over sold out to them 3 years back. The new owners cutting hours and raising gate fees within the first 6 months. The kind of story that made independent yards like Ray's feel more precious by comparison, rather than obsolete. He'd applied to their yard manager training program almost 2 months earlier on a whim, back before things with Tess had gotten serious, mostly because the posted salary had made him do a double take, and he'd honestly forgotten about the application until the letter landed in his hand. The number on the offer was real, $68,000 a year plus full benefits and a signing bonus large enough to cover his entire loan shortfall in one shot. More money than he'd ever made in his life, with one catch buried in the fine print that made him set the letter down and read it twice to be sure he hadn't misunderstood. The position was based at their regional flagship facility 3 states east, a 6-week paid training program required before he could even start. And the role itself, once trained, would keep him there permanently, managing somebody else's yard instead of building toward owning his own. He didn't bring it up to Tess right away, sat with the letter on his kitchen table for 2 full days, turning the decision over from every angle, running the math on what $18,000 actually meant against what leaving Vance Salvage, leaving Ray, leaving this whole life he'd spent a decade building actually meant. And it was Tess herself who finally noticed something was off, showing up Sunday afternoon for their usual spreadsheet session and finding him distracted enough that he entered the same part number into 3 different rows without catching it. "You've been somewhere else all afternoon," Tess said, closing her laptop halfway. "What's going on?" Dominic pulled the offer letter out of his back pocket, unfolded it on the counter between them without saying anything at first, letting her read it herself instead of trying to explain it in a way that made him sound less conflicted than he actually was. $68,000, Tess said, scanning the page. "Dominic, that's more than double what you're making now." "I know," Dominic said. "Signing bonus alone covers the whole loan shortfall. I could walk into that bank in 6 weeks with the down payment, fully funded, easy approval, no more hedging. But you'd have to leave," Tess said, setting the letter down carefully. 6 weeks of training out of state, then permanent placement wherever they need a yard manager," Dominic said. "No guarantee it's even here. Could be 3 states away for good." Tess was quiet for a moment, running her thumb along the edge of the laptop, working through it the same deliberate way she'd worked through a stuck bolt her first night at the yard. "What do you actually want, setting the money aside for a second?" "I want to own something," Dominic said, the honesty of it coming out rougher than he expected. "Not manage somebody else's yard on their schedule with their rules. I want Ray's name and my name both on that sign out front, same way it's been his and his brother's for 30 years before me. That's never been about the money exactly. The money's just the wall I keep running into trying to get there." "Then why are you even considering this?" Tess asked, gentle but direct. "Because $18,000 doesn't just appear out of nowhere for guys like me," Dominic said. "And I don't know how many more years Ray's got in him to keep waiting on a bank that doesn't trust me yet. Maybe the smart move is take the safe money now, build the credit clean for a few years, come back and buy in properly later instead of scraping for it now and risking losing the whole opportunity to somebody else's cash offer. Or maybe you go take the training, see what it's actually like, and figure out from the inside whether it's worth what it costs you," Tess said. "You don't have to decide the whole rest of your life sitting at this counter tonight." Dominic looked at her for a long moment, something easing slightly in his shoulders at the practical, unpanicked way she'd laid it out. No dramatics, no ultimatum. Just the same steady logic she brought to a stubborn bolt or a messy spreadsheet. "You're not going to ask me to just turn it down for you?" "I'm not your excuse to avoid a hard decision," Tess said, quiet but firm. "If you take this because of me and it doesn't work out, you'll resent both the choice and me for being part of it. Go find out what it actually is. I'll still be here handling the interchange spreadsheet either way." 2 weeks later, Dominic stood in the gravel lot of Vance Salvage at 6 in the morning with a packed duffel bag in the bed of his truck. Ray leaning against the booth with his arms crossed and an expression that was trying hard to look unbothered and mostly failing. and Tess standing near the gate in her work uniform on her way to open the parts counter, having swung by specifically to see him off before 6 weeks of distance officially started. "Call when you land," Tess said, adjusting the strap of her own bag over one shoulder. "And keep an eye on whether their interchange system's actually better than mine, because if it's not, I want to hear you admit it." "It won't be," Dominic said, something almost like a smile fighting through the nerves, clearly sitting behind his eyes. "Yours has character. Theirs is just a database." "Character doesn't pay 18 grand toward a loan," Tess said, but she was smiling too, walking closer and pulling him into a hug that neither of them tried to make into something bigger than it was. Just two people who'd built something real out of spare parts and Saturday afternoons, and about to find out whether 6 weeks of distance could survive contact with a bigger paycheck in a different state entirely. He climbed into his truck, backed out of the lot past rows of stacked cars, catching the first gray light of morning, and Tess stood next to Ray at the gate watching his taillights disappear down Route 9. Neither one of them saying much of anything. Both of them thinking the same quiet thought about whether the man they'd both built something around was about to come back the same person who'd left. 19 days into the 6-week training program, Dominic Vance stood behind a computer terminal at Continental Auto Recycler's flagship facility, watching a regional manager deny a fee waiver to a guy who'd been coming to that yard for 11 years straight. And it was the exact moment he finally understood what $68,000 a year was actually buying from him. What started as 6 weeks of proving he could handle a bigger paycheck turned into the week Dominic figured out that some things a paycheck couldn't replace. And he made the call that ended up changing both his life and Tess's before the training program even finished. The facility itself was nothing like Vance Salvage. 300 acres of stacked vehicles organized by a computerized inventory system that told customers exactly which row and rack held their part before they even walked the yard. Uniformed staff working behind glass partition counters instead of a plywood booth. Everything standardized down to the script employees were required to read off a laminated card when greeting a customer at the gate. Dominic had spent the first 2 weeks genuinely impressed by the efficiency of it. The inventory software alone doing in seconds what Ray's binder system took minutes to accomplish. And he'd caught himself thinking maybe this really was just a smarter, bigger version of the same work he already knew how to do. He roomed alone in a corporate extended stay suite that smelled like industrial carpet cleaner, no matter how many times housekeeping came through. Ate dinner most nights standing at a kitchenette counter instead of sitting down, and found himself texting Tess photos of the facility's inventory software with a kind of forced enthusiasm that even he could tell was thinner by the second week than it had been the first. The gap started showing itself in small moments that piled up faster than Dominic expected. A regional policy required every gate fee to be collected in full, regardless of circumstance. No exceptions logged anywhere in the system for regulars. No room for a manager to wave somebody through because they'd been coming for a decade and just needed a $5 sensor clip they could have grabbed off a shelf. And when Dominic asked his training supervisor about it during week 2, the answer came back flat and final. "Consistency across all locations," the supervisor said. "We don't make exceptions based on individual manager relationships. That's exactly the kind of variability corporate wants standardized out of the system." Dominic thought about Ray immediately, about the dozens of times he'd watched his uncle wave a regular through the gate for free on a slow Tuesday, or knock $10 off a part for somebody clearly stretching a tight paycheck. Decisions made in the moment, because Ray actually knew the person standing in front of him and knew what that $5 or $10 meant to them that particular week. It wasn't sloppy business, Dominic realized. Standing there at the terminal, it was the entire point of running a yard where the owner actually lived in the community he served instead of managing a facility 3 states from wherever corporate happened to place him. The 19th day crystallized it. A man in his 60s walked up to Dominic's counter looking for a starter motor for a '98 Silverado, the kind of truck people kept running for decades if they could. And when the system flagged his account for a return check from 4 months back, standard policy required Dominic to deny the sale entirely until the balance cleared. No partial payment allowed, no manager discretion to work something out. The man's face did something Dominic recognized immediately. The particular flat embarrassment of somebody who'd hit a rough patch and was now being reminded of it by a stranger reading off a screen. And Dominic stood there behind the counter, following policy to the letter, while every instinct he'd built over a decade at his uncle's yard screamed that this wasn't how you treated a person, this was how you treated a transaction. He called Tess that night from the hotel room Continental had put him up in for the 6 weeks, sitting on the edge of a bed that felt too clean and too anonymous to actually rest in. "I don't think I can do that," he said, before she'd even finished saying hello. "Tell me what happened," Tess said, and he could hear the parts counter noise behind her, the tail end of her own shift winding down. Dominic walked her through it: the fee waiver, the starter motor, the flat consistency of a system that had no room in it for actually knowing a customer. And Tess listened without interrupting, the same patient attention she'd once given a stuck bolt. "That's not who you are," she said finally. "You've spent your whole life learning to look at a specific person's specific problem and figure out how to actually help them. That system's asking you to stop doing the one thing you're best at." "Signing bonus is still $68,000 a year," Dominic said, half arguing with himself more than with her. "That's real money, Tess. That fixes the loan problem in one shot." "It fixes one problem and creates a bigger one," Tess said. "You'll have money and no yard with your name on it. No Ray, no me, probably, unless I'm supposed to just move wherever they station you next." Dominic sat with that for a long moment, the hotel room's air conditioning humming steady in the background. "How's Ray holding up? He's been quiet every time I call him." "He's fine," Tess said. "I've been coming by most Sundays helping him with the counter and the interchange sheets, same as before. Had a rush last weekend. Some guy needed 4 different suspension parts off the same wrecked Silverado, and Ray let me run the whole pull myself while he worked the register. Told me afterward I've got better hands for it than half the guys he's hired over the years." "You've basically got a second job now," Dominic said, something in his voice loosening for the first time since he'd picked up the phone. "I've got a place I actually like being," Tess said. "That's different from a second job. But Dominic, I need you to hear something clearly, because I don't want you making this decision about me. I'm managing fine. Ray's managing fine. If you come home, I need it to be because you actually want that yard in this life, not because you think either of us needs rescuing while you're gone." "I know that," Dominic said quiet. "I'm not calling because I think you need me back. I'm calling because I finally figured out what I actually want. And it's not a bigger paycheck 3 states away from all of it." He gave notice the following morning, more than 3 weeks short of completing the 6-week program, and because trainees weren't bound by the same 2-week notice policy as full employees, Continental let him go the same day. His supervisor didn't even ask why, just processed the paperwork on a tablet and told him HR would mail his final check within 10 business days. Standard procedure, no room in the system for a conversation about it either way, which only confirmed everything Dominic had already decided. He drove the 11 hours back to Route 9 in one long stretch, stopping only for gas and coffee that tasted like it had been sitting on a warmer since morning. Pulling into the gravel lot of Vance Salvage a little after 9 at night, with his headlights sweeping across rows of stacked cars, he'd missed more than he expected to admit out loud. Ray was still in the booth doing his end-of-day paperwork by lamplight when Dominic walked up, and the old man looked up, studied his nephew's face for a long second, and set his pen down without much surprise in his expression at all. "Figured you'd be back before the 6 weeks was up," Ray said. "You've never been much good at pretending to want something you don't actually want." "Turned down the offer," Dominic said. "I want to buy in here. I know the loan's still short." Ray leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, something thoughtful settling into his weathered face. "What if I carry the note myself instead of you fighting that bank another year? Seller financing, we draw up the paperwork proper with a lawyer. You pay me directly over 5 years instead of the bank cutting you loose every time your credit report looks a little rough around the edges. I trust you more than any loan officer's going to, and frankly, I'd rather see my own money keep this place running than watch you hand a chunk of your life to some corporation for a signing bonus." Dominic stared at his uncle for a moment, the offer landing somewhere he hadn't let himself hope it would land. "You'd do that?" Would have offered it 2 months ago if you'd asked, Ray said. Gruff in the particular way that meant he was covering something softer underneath it. Didn't figure you wanted to hear it phrased like charity. Figured you needed to bang your head against that bank a little first. Tess showed up at the yard the next morning before her own shift, finding Dominic and Ray already bent over a folding table set up just outside the booth, a stack of paperwork between them that neither man seemed fully equipped to parse line by line, and she pulled up a folding chair without being asked. Ray's lawyer had drafted the agreement 2 days earlier, seller financing terms and a 5-year payment schedule spelled out in the kind of dense legal language neither Ray nor Dominic felt confident reading on their own, and Tess started working through it page by page, not correcting the legal substance, just flagging anything that didn't make plain sense to her so the lawyer could clarify it before signing. This clause here, about maintenance responsibilities during the transition period, she said, tapping the paragraph. I can't tell if that means Ray's covering repairs until the sale finalizes, or you are, Dominic. That needs to go back to the lawyer and get spelled out before anybody signs anything, because that's exactly the kind of thing that turns into an argument over a broken forklift 6 months from now. That's why I need you two in the room, Ray said, sliding the paperwork toward her. Neither of us reads contracts for a living, and the lawyer's not going to catch what confuses us if we don't tell him. They spent the better part of that Saturday working through the agreement page by page, Tess marking every unclear clause for the lawyer to revise, Dominic and Ray hashing out the actual numbers between them, and by the time they finished, the three of them had built something real out of a folding table and a stack of paperwork outside a plywood booth. No grand gesture in any of it, just careful, unglamorous work towards something that would actually hold up. The lawyer turned the revised draft around 5 days later. Every clause Tess had flagged, rewritten in language all three of them could actually follow without a law degree. And the following Monday morning, Ray finally signed his half in front of a notary they'd arranged to stop by the booth. Dominic signing his own name underneath his uncle's, with a pen that had definitely seen better days. The same pen Ray had used to write receipts out of that battered book for 30 straight years. 3 months later, on a warm Saturday morning, with the gate freshly propped open, Tess pulled into the gravel lot the way she had 100 times by now, and stopped for a second at the sight of the yard's old wooden sign, freshly repainted, Vance Salvage, You Pull. It's still across the top in the same lettering it had always carried, but underneath it now, in fresh paint that hadn't fully weathered yet, Ray and Dominic Vance, prop. Dominic was up on a stepladder finishing the last letter when she walked up, and he climbed down, wiping a smudge of white paint off his knuckles. Bank never even entered the picture, Tess said, looking up at the sign. Turns out you don't need a bank when you've got an uncle who trusts you and a girlfriend who reads contracts for fun, Dominic said. And something easy passed between them standing there in the morning light. The yard behind them full of the same stacked cars, the same rows, the same $40 parts that had started this whole thing 8 months back. I don't read contracts for fun, Tess said. I read them because somebody has to make sure the person I care about doesn't get taken advantage of. Same thing coming from you, Dominic said, and pulled her into a hug that smelled like fresh paint and old motor oil. Exactly the two smells that had somehow ended up meaning home to both of them. So here's the